A couple of months ago, I made a recording of the B minor Prelude from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, and since then I've gotten a few requests to discuss the phrasing in the left hand. So I'm going to do this in this video, and at the end I'm also going to include the recording that I made of the piece, only this time I'm simply going to show the score as well, so that you can follow along. Before we talk about the phrasing for the left hand, I think it's important to establish the texture and the kind of genre that Bach is alluding to in this piece. What I mean by this is that if you look at it, you will notice that this is very much structured like a trio sonata, like a movement of the trio sonata, with the right hand having the two melody instruments, and then the left hand being, so to speak, the basso continuo. So if for a moment we look at the right hand, you will notice that we are basically dealing with two voices, and like in a trio sonata where we have two melody instruments, those voices are written fairly close to each other, and of course they are kind of interrelated, so they're playing off one another. So very briefly, this is just the right hand, but notice that we're dealing really with two voices. You can almost imagine two melody instruments like two violins or something like that playing this. And then the left hand is doing the basso continuo, and actually what it is, the way it's constructed, it's basically a series of eighth notes with very, very few exceptions. We have this constant eighth note motion, which oftentimes we refer to as the walking bass. And what I would say, first of all, is if we're going to render this in a way that animates it, in the way that brings it to life, I think it's important, and I think this is generally important for Baroque music, not to interpret the score literally. Because really, if you're just going to play what is on the page, the left hand, this is what's going to happen. Let me see if I can play it correctly, because I'm used to not playing what I see. So this is the traditional 20th century interpretation of playing exactly what we see. So I think we need to work a little bit against that. So the first thing I would say is that going back to Baroque performance practice, every eighth note is not the same. Everything depends on where the note is in relation to the meter, whether it's on the beat, whether it's off the beat, whether it's part of the harmony, whether it's not part of the harmony. So what I try to do here is that I look at this and I emphasize the first note. I want to emphasize the first eighth note in a group of 4 eighth notes. And the basic way I think of it is to emphasize the first note more and then progressively emphasize the notes less as I go. So I'm holding on to the first eighth note, and I'm also delaying a little bit. I'm kind of staying a little bit longer on it, so that the next notes are going to be a little more detached, progressively more detached, but also ever so slightly faster, so that you get something like this. Now, the other thing is, once we establish this kind of idea, the notion of emphasizing the first note and lingering onto the first note, to me at least, it's important not to fall into that pattern for the rest of the piece, because in some respects then we create the same kind of boring texture that you would if you were to play everything simply as you see it. So I try to vary that in different ways, And the way I do it is by simply looking for clues in the score, but also looking for how Bach changes the motion of these eighth notes, and then modifying what I do accordingly. So if we have a stepwise motion, I may do something like this. But then if we don't have a stepwise motion, if we start having leaps, and if the first and the second note are related harmonically, they're part of the same chord, then I'm going to hold the first note even longer. So notice that when I get to the third measure, I'm starting with the second measure here. Right? Because this is part of the harmony, so I can hold it even longer. Then I try to look for places in the score where this four-note pattern seems to break up into two different notes. This happens in different cadential points throughout the piece. So for example, if I were to keep going, so I'm trying, in other words, all sorts of different things. The basic idea is always emphasizing the first note, but then as the piece progresses and as the patterns change, I also change the patterns myself. Sometimes I linger more, sometimes I linger less, I hold notes more, I hold notes less. Sometimes I may even decide not to follow completely what I'm saying to provide variety in what I do. So this is what I would do throughout the piece. The other thing that I would like to point out a little bit is at the very end, where Bach changes the pattern a little more, and instead of something that is mostly diatonic, becomes very, very chromatic. And at that moment, I really try to hold onto every single note as much as I can to emphasize this chromaticism. So this is now at the end of the piece, at the end of the second section, where we have something like this. So I try to really let each note bleed into the other, so to speak. Now, as a short demonstration, I'm going to play just the left hand of the first section so that you get an idea of what I do. And then at the end, as I said, I will include the video of the recording that I made 2 months ago. Only this time I will have the score scrolling along so that you can see what I'm doing. You will probably notice that what I'm doing here may not totally match what I do in the recording. The recording was 2 months ago. I like not to do the same thing, so I always like to vary things. And obviously here I'm simply playing the left hand. Part of my interpretive decision has to do always with what the other hand is doing. So here I'm not completely reacting to the other two voices on the right hand, so I'm simply doing the left hand. But I hope that you get an idea if I play it on its own, and then you can hear the whole performance and see what I do and pay more attention, I guess, to the left hand. So thank you for watching. I hope this at least gives you an idea of what I'm doing. Obviously, some of the things that I'm describing here may not totally work on the piano. So again, I'm not saying don't play the piece on the piano. That's a whole different subject. But just to keep in mind that the resonance and the character of the piano and the harpsichord are two totally different instruments. So some of the things that I'm doing here may not totally work on the piano. On the other hand, the only advice I would offer to pianists is don't always rely just on volume for expression. Think about phrasing. You can do a lot more with phrasing than sometimes we're taught. So now follows the video. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, please write below. Thank you very much.